The deal sounds simple on paper. You see something you should not have seen. You hear something you should not have heard. You are pulled into a room with men in suits, given a phone number, given a promise of protection, and asked to share what you know. In return, the most powerful government on earth tells you that you are safe. But for the people in these stories, that promise was a lie. The moment they said yes, a clock started ticking that they could not see. Some were sold out by the very police officers who were supposed to protect them. Some were kidnapped from their own streets. Some had their families taken first. And some were killed in ways meant not just to end them, but to send a message to anyone watching. Today, we are covering 10 cases of cartel informants who paid the highest price for telling the truth. What you are about to hear will change how you think about every promise the system makes to a witness, the people who agreed to talk, and the men who made sure they never spoke again. Section 1. Enrique Kiki Camarena Salazar and the Guadalajara Cartel. In February of 1985, the world of international law enforcement was changed forever by what happened to one man in the Mexican city of Guadalajara. His name was Enrique Camarena Salazar, but everyone who knew him called him Kiki. He was a special agent for the United States Drug Enforcement Administration. He was 37 years old. He had a wife named Mica and 3 young sons named Enrique, Eric, and Daniel, who were 11, 6, and 4 years old at the time. On the afternoon of February 7, 1985, Kiki walked out of the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara to go meet his wife for lunch. He never made it to that lunch. What happened to him over the next 2 days became the most studied and documented case of cartel revenge against a U.S. law enforcement asset in modern history. Kiki was born in Mexicali, Mexico in 1947, and his family moved to Calexico, California when he was a child. He served in the Marines for 2 years, then joined the Calexico Police Department, and in 1973, he joined the brand new DEA. By 1980, he had been transferred to Mexico, where he brought Mica and the boys with him. Kiki had a real gift for one specific part of the job, which was working with informants. The author Elaine Shannon, who wrote one of the most respected books on the case, said that nobody else in the Guadalajara office could match his ability to win the trust of dangerous men and convince them to share information. That gift turned him into a serious problem for 3 of the most powerful drug traffickers in Mexico at the time. Their names were Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero. Together, they ran what became known as the Guadalajara Cartel. In 1982, working with an informant the DEA called Miguel Sanchez, Kiki tracked down a giant marijuana plantation that was over 200 acres. The bigger one came in 1984. Acting on intelligence the DEA had built up, 450 Mexican soldiers, backed by helicopters, destroyed a plantation in Allende, Chihuahua, called Rancho Buffalo. It covered around 2,500 acres. Its annual production was estimated to be worth roughly $8 billion. Caro Quintero alone lost something close to $50 million in destroyed product. Caro Quintero believed his ranch had been protected by powerful people inside the Mexican military, and that protection had failed. He wanted to know who had given the Americans the information that brought it down. The cartel decided the source was Kiki Camarena, and they began planning what they would do about him. On the afternoon of February 7, 1985, as Kiki walked toward the parking lot to drive to lunch, 5 armed men surrounded him. They were corrupt Mexican officials working at the direction of the cartel. They forced him into a car at gunpoint and drove away. A few hours later, those same officials grabbed a second man, a Mexican pilot named Alfredo Zavala Avelar. Zavala had been flying surveillance missions for the DEA, helping spot plantations from the air. He was, in every real sense, an informant for the U.S. government. Both men were taken to a private home at 881 Lope de Vega in the Jardines del Bosque neighborhood of Guadalajara. The house belonged to Rafael Caro Quintero himself. The interrogation was led by Sergio Espino Verdin, a commander in the Mexican Federal Security Directorate, an intelligence agency that had been bought by the cartel years earlier. The cartel wanted Kiki to tell them everything he knew, including the names of his informants, the structure of the DEA's intelligence in Mexico, and the names of any Mexican officials he was working with. The interrogation was recorded on tape. According to U.S. court findings, a physician was brought in to keep Kiki alive and conscious for as long as possible so that the questions could continue. That physician was later identified as Humberto Alvarez Machain. The interrogation went on for around 30 hours. The DEA has stated that Kiki passed away on or around February 9, 1985. For weeks, nobody outside the cartel knew where he was. Mika reported him missing the same day he disappeared, and Washington launched the largest homicide investigation in DEA history. It was given the code name Operation Leyenda, the Spanish word for legend. The Reagan administration applied enormous pressure on the Mexican government. On March 5, 1985, the bodies of Kiki Camarena and Alfredo Zavala Avelar were found wrapped in plastic on a rural property near the small town of La Angostura in the state of Michoacán. Kiki was 37 years old. He left behind Mika, who was widowed at the same age, and 3 boys who had been waiting for their dad to come home. The investigation reached into the highest levels of the Mexican government. The 3 cartel leaders, Felix Gallardo, Fonseca Carrillo, and Caro Quintero, were eventually identified, arrested, and convicted in Mexican courts, each sentenced to 40 years in prison. But the case did not stay closed. In 2013, in a turn that shocked Kiki's family and the entire DEA, a Mexican appellate court ordered Caro Quintero released from prison early on a technical ruling about which court had heard his original case. He walked out a free man and disappeared into hiding. For the DEA, that was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a brand new chase. And the next time Kiki Camarena's name came back into the headlines, it would be tied to a manhunt that ran for nearly a decade. Section 2. The Colombian DEA informant and the Beltran Leva organization. In the late 2000s, the Beltran Leva organization was one of the most powerful drug cartels in all of Mexico. The group was run by a set of brothers, with Arturo Beltran Leva at the top. Their main business was simple. Their suppliers in Colombia would meet Mexican boats in small submarines out in international waters. The Colombians would hand over huge loads of cocaine. The Mexican vessels would carry the cocaine back to shore. From there, the cartel moved it through Mexico and into the United States. For years, this entire system worked without a single major problem. The Beltran Leva brothers were getting rich. Their Colombian partners were getting paid. And the U.S. authorities almost never seemed to know where to be. Then, sometime between 2007 and 2008, all of that changed. For a stretch of about 6 to 7 months in a row, the boats and the small submarines kept getting intercepted by the United States Drug Enforcement Administration. Loads that were supposed to land safely in Mexico were instead being seized at sea. Each loss meant tens of millions of dollars in cocaine that the cartel never got to sell. The brothers knew this could not be a coincidence or bad luck. The pattern was too clean. The DEA was always in the right place at the right time. Somebody close to the cartel or close to their Colombian suppliers was talking. Arturo Beltran Leva ordered his lieutenants to find the leak. He also reached out for help to the people who had been protecting his organization for years, which meant high-ranking corrupt officials inside the Mexican federal police. According to courtroom testimony given later in U.S. federal court by former cartel boss Sergio Villarreal Barragan, who is known by the nickname El Grande, those officials came to a meeting carrying a cardboard binder. Inside the binder was a photograph of a man, along with his name and his nickname. The man was a Colombian. He had been arrested by U.S. authorities in Miami. He had agreed to cooperate with the DEA in exchange for being released. He had then quietly moved into the cartel's supply network as a confidential source for American law enforcement. According to El Grande's testimony, the way the cartel got the informant's identity was through corrupt police channels at the highest level of the Mexican government. A federal police officer who was stationed in Colombia had access to the information. From there, it traveled up the chain to a senior official named Luis Cardenas Palomino. Cardenas Palomino, in turn, told his close friend and boss, Genaro Garcia Luna. At the time, Garcia Luna was the Secretary of Public Security for Mexico under President Felipe Calderón. He oversaw the federal police, the prison system, and a large intelligence network. He was the most senior law enforcement figure in the entire country, and the United States considered him a trusted partner in the fight against the cartels. What El Grande told the U.S. court was that Cardenas Palomino had spoken with Garcia Luna and had then come back to a meeting at a ranch in central Mexico to share what he had learned. He told the cartel leaders the informant's name. He told them his nickname. He confirmed the man had been working with the DEA. Arturo Beltran Leva looked at the photograph in the binder and gave a direct order. The informant was to be kidnapped, questioned, and killed. Arturo's orders were always followed. Two of his high-ranking lieutenants tracked the Colombian informant down in a city in central Mexico. They grabbed him and took him to a private location. According to court testimony, the informant admitted under questioning that he had indeed been arrested in Miami and had been cooperating with U.S. authorities. After that admission, the cartel did exactly what they had said they would do. The Colombian was killed, and his body was disposed of. The full identity of that informant has never been publicly released, even years later. The DEA has not named him. The court records refer to him as a confidential source. His family has never been mentioned in public testimony. What the world does know is what was said under oath in U.S. federal court and what was reported in detail by The Intercept and by the Mexican journalist Anabel Hernandez. He was a real human being. He had taken a deal with the U.S. government. He believed that deal would protect him. The men who were supposed to be protecting him on the Mexican side were the ones who handed over his name. The story did not stay buried. Years later, all of the people involved on the law enforcement side ended up in U.S. custody. Ivan Reyes Arzate, the federal police commander known as La Reina, was caught providing sensitive information to cartels and was sentenced in U.S. federal courts. Cardenas Palomino was arrested and is currently incarcerated in Mexico. And Genaro Garcia Luna, the man who once stood on stage with U.S. presidents and Mexican presidents as a hero of the drug war, was arrested in Texas in 2019. In 2023, he was convicted in a Brooklyn federal court of taking massive bribes from the Sinaloa cartel and the Beltran Leva organization, while serving as Mexico's top law enforcement official. The trial included testimony tying him directly to the leak that got the Colombian informant killed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. For one Colombian man working alone against a cartel, the betrayal had come not from another criminal, but from inside the very government he had trusted to protect him. His case showed how dangerous it was to be a snitch in Mexico in the 2000s. But it was not the only place the rules had collapsed. In another part of the country, on the United States border, an entire house was already being used by a cartel for the same purpose, and a U.S. government informant was holding the keys. Section 3. The House of Death and the Juarez Cartel Informant Killings. In the early 2000s, in the Mexican border city of Ciudad Juarez, a small house in a quiet middle-class neighborhood became one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the entire history of the Mexican drug war. The address was 3633 Calle Parsioneros. From the outside, it looked like any other home on the block. Inside the backyard, however, members of the Juarez cartel were burying the bodies of people they had killed. By the time the truth came out, at least 12 bodies were pulled from that property, most of them showing signs of severe injuries. What made this case different from any other cartel killing site in Mexico was not just the number of victims. It was the fact that one of the men with the keys to the house was a paid informant working for the United States government. The informant's real name was Guillermo Eduardo Ramirez Pero. He went by the nickname Lalo. Before he became an asset for U.S. law enforcement, Lalo had been a Mexican highway patrol officer. At some point in the early 2000s, he was recruited as a paid informant by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security. He was officially listed in U.S. government files as informant number 913. He also passed information to the DEA on the side. His job, in theory, was a clean and clear one. He was supposed to get inside the Juarez cartel, gather intelligence, and pass it back to his American handlers. The cartel was one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in Mexico at the time, and getting somebody on the inside was considered a major win for U.S. agencies. Lalo did exactly what they wanted in one sense. He worked his way deep into the operation. He earned the trust of a senior cartel figure named Heriberto Santillan Tavares. He became part of Santillan's inner circle. The problem was the price he paid to keep that cover. According to court documents, recordings, and reporting by NPR, The Guardian, and others, Lalo was not just standing nearby while crimes happened. He admitted to being present during multiple killings. He admitted to driving at least 2 victims to the house in Juarez where he knew they were going to be killed. In the case of the very first death at that house, he secretly recorded the entire event on tape. He later admitted that during that recording, he held the legs of the victim while the man was being killed. What made this story explode across both sides of the border was what U.S. officials supposedly knew and when they knew it. According to documents obtained by NPR and a former DEA special agent named Phil Jordan, who served as an expert witness in a later civil case, ICE knew about the killings as they were happening. They knew where the bodies were being buried. They knew Lalo was involved. They did not share that information with the Mexican government, and they did not pull Lalo out. The killings simply continued. The cartel had a code phrase they used over the phone whenever it was time to take another person to the house. The phrase was that they were going to have a barbecue. Lalo, who held the keys, would meet them there. According to a document NPR obtained, on at least one occasion, Lalo stopped at a hardware store on his way to the house and bought duct tape and quicklime. Both items had clear purposes. The duct tape was used to bind the victim. The quicklime was used to help break down the remains in the backyard. He later told Mexican authorities about that hardware store stop himself. The killings at the House of Death continued from 2003 until January 2004. The site is believed to have been used by the Juarez cartel to deal with people they considered rivals, or, in the worst irony of the entire case, with people they suspected of being snitches. Many of the victims were never publicly named. 2 of them, however, were U.S. residents, which is part of what later allowed the families to bring a lawsuit against the U.S. government in American courts. When the Mexican government finally became aware of what was happening at 3633 Calle Parsioneros, they sent investigators to dig up the backyard. They worked through the night. As one woman who sat outside the property during the exhumations later told NPR, every time the workers pulled out another body, the smell would hit the small group standing on the street. The final count from that single property was at least 12 bodies. Each one had a family. Each one was a missing person whose disappearance had quietly been ignored or covered up for months. What followed was a years-long legal mess on both sides of the border. Heriberto Santillan-Tabares, the cartel boss Lalo had been working with, was extradited and prosecuted in the United States. As part of a plea deal, however, he was convicted on drug trafficking charges, not on murder charges. The U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Texas at the time, Johnny Sutton, was publicly criticized by other federal agents for the way the case was handled. A former DEA leader described what had been allowed to happen as giving the informant a license to do whatever he wanted. The families of the victims sued the U.S. government for wrongful death. Lalo himself was eventually placed in a high-security holding facility in the United States, where he fought against being sent back to Mexico, saying that going back would mean certain death. The House of Death showed how badly things could go when an informant was kept in place at any cost. But not every cartel message to suspected snitches was kept hidden. Sometimes the cartel chose to send their warning out into the open, on a public street, in the worst way the world had ever seen. Section 4. Hugo Hernandez and the Sinaloa Cartel. Warning to suspected snitches. By the start of 2010, the war between the Sinaloa Cartel and the Juarez Cartel had been going on for years and was at its absolute peak. Both organizations were fighting for control of one of the most valuable drug smuggling corridors in the world, the routes that ran from western Mexico across the border into the United States. By that point, more than 15,000 people had been killed in cartel-related violence in Mexico under the crackdown launched by President Felipe Calderón. Most of those deaths happened along the northern border. Cities like Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana had become open battlegrounds. In that kind of environment, the cartels were not only killing each other for territory, they were also using extreme public displays as a form of pressure, both against their rivals and against anyone they suspected of working with the other side. One of the most disturbing examples came in the first week of January 2010 in a small city in the state of Sinaloa called Los Mochis. The victim's name was Hugo Hernandez. He was 36 years old. According to the Associated Press, NBC News, Fox News, the Seattle Times, and the Sinaloa State Prosecutor's Office, Hugo Hernandez was taken on January 2, 2010. He was kidnapped in the state of Sonora, which sits right next door to Sinaloa. The area where he was grabbed was known as a region used heavily for marijuana cultivation, which means cartel activity was already deeply rooted there. According to a spokesman for the Sinaloa prosecutors named Martin Robles, the men who took Hugo drove him across the state line and into Sinaloa, the heart of the Sinaloa cartel's territory. From the moment he was put into that vehicle, he had no chance of getting away. He was now in the hands of one of the most powerful organizations in the country. The exact reason for his abduction was never publicly confirmed by authorities, but what they did with him afterward made the message clear. He was being used as a warning, and the warning was aimed at members of the rival Juarez cartel. 7 days later, on January 9, 2010, the people of Los Mochis began finding pieces of him scattered across their city. Sinaloa state prosecutors confirmed every detail to international news agencies. His remains had been split into 7 separate parts and dropped in different public places around the city. His torso was placed inside a plastic container at one location. His arms, his legs, and his skull were placed inside a separate box at another location. The most disturbing part of the discovery was placed in a plastic bag near Los Mochis City Hall, in plain view, in the middle of the day. The cartel members had taken the skin from his face and sewn it onto a soccer ball. Along with the remains was a written note. The note read, "Happy New Year, because this will be your last." The threat was directed at members of the Juarez cartel. For the people who studied cartel violence, this was something new. Mexican prosecutors and reporters from outlets like the Associated Press described what was done to Hugo Hernandez as a step into a new level of brutality, even by the standards of the country's drug war. Beheadings and dumped bodies had already become an almost daily event by 2010. The Sinaloa cartel was specifically choosing the most public, most theatrical, and most disturbing form of message they could come up with. The point was not just to kill a man. The point was to make absolutely sure that anyone connected to the Juarez cartel, or anyone thinking about cooperating with them, would see what had been done and remember it. In a war for control of billions of dollars in smuggling routes, fear was a weapon, and Hugo's body was being used to deliver it. What made the case especially heartbreaking is how little is publicly known about Hugo Hernandez himself. The Sinaloa prosecutor's office never publicly released a clear explanation of why he in particular was chosen. Some reports described him as a low-level street figure. Others simply identified him as a 36-year-old man taken from a known marijuana growing area. He was not a famous cartel boss. He was not a public figure. He was not in any United States court file. He was a regular person who ended up on the wrong side of the wrong organization at the worst possible time, and his death became one of the most widely covered cartel killings of the entire year, not because of who he was, but because of what was done to him. In the weeks that followed, the story spread around the world. The Sinaloa State Prosecutor's Office confirmed every detail at a press briefing. International outlets including the BBC, NBC News, the Seattle Times, Fox News, Reuters, the Associated Press, and Gulf News all carried the same reporting. Years later, the case is still cited in academic papers and law journals as a turning point in how cartels in Mexico were using public displays of cruelty to terrorize their enemies and warn anyone thinking about flipping or talking to the other side. It also became one of the most often referenced examples when American lawmakers later debated whether to label Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. For Hugo Hernandez's family, almost none of that bigger picture mattered. They had to identify their son in pieces. They had to bury him in pieces. The men who killed him have, to this day, never been publicly named or arrested. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Sinaloa cartel's message in Los Mochis was a warning sent across the border to a rival group. Not long after, on the other side of the country, an even larger warning would be sent. This time, it would not be aimed at one informant or one rival cartel member. It would be aimed at an entire town. Section 5. The Allende Massacre and the Los Zetas Hunt for an Informant. By 2011, the most feared cartel in all of Mexico was a group called Los Zetas. They had originally been formed by deserters from the Mexican Army's Special Forces, which is why they were trained, organized, and equipped at a level that was different from any other cartel in the country. Their leaders at the time were two brothers, Miguel Ángel Treviño Morales, who went by the cartel call sign Z40, and his brother, Omar Treviño Morales, who was known as Z42. Their stronghold was the small ranching town of Allende in the northern Mexican state of Coahuila, just 25 miles from the U.S. border. From the outside, Allende looked like a quiet town. Inside, the entire local government, the police department, the mayor's office, and even the fire department had been compromised by Los Zetas. The cartel paid the police a small monthly amount to look the other way and to bring them anyone they wanted. The town was theirs. What set off the Allende massacre was a leak inside the cartel itself. According to detailed reporting by ProPublica journalist Ginger Thompson, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration had been working with one of the Trevino brothers' own operatives in Texas, a man named Jose Vasquez Jr. The DEA had obtained the special tracking codes for the personal phones used by the two brothers. With those codes, U.S. agents could find the brothers anywhere in Mexico in real time. It was the closest the United States had ever come to capturing the leadership of Los Zetas. Then, the DEA shared those tracking codes with a special vetted unit of the Mexican Federal Police known as the Sensitive Investigative Unit. That unit had a long history of leaking information to the cartels. Within a very short window of time, the codes ended up in the hands of the very men they were supposed to help capture. The Trevino brothers now knew that someone close to them was talking to the Americans. Their suspicion fell on a Zetas cell run by a man named Mario Cuellar, who had once been a Mexican federal police officer. Cuellar's group was based in Allende. One of his deputies was a young man named Jose Luis Garza Jr., nicknamed El Huichin. The Garza family had been one of the oldest and best-known families in the area for generations. They owned ranches, businesses, and houses across the town. When the leak was traced back, the Trevinos decided that the punishment would not just hit Cuellar and El Huichin, it would hit their entire bloodline and anyone tied to them, and anyone unfortunate enough to be near them. On the night of March 18, 2011, the killing began. According to sworn statements collected by Coahuila state prosecutors and published by the National Security Archive, dozens of armed Zetas, possibly as many as 60, swept through Allende and the towns around it in a coordinated 3-day sweep. They worked in small teams of 4 men each, called estacas. They drove trucks. They used heavy machinery to ram gates. They went into homes and ranches connected to the Garza family and pulled people out. They took grandparents. They took workers. They took friends. They took people who had simply stopped by the wrong ranch on the wrong day to pick up something simple like medicine for animals. The local police department, on direct orders from their director, blocked off streets, stood guard outside the ranch entrances, and made sure no one interfered. The captives were taken to a property known as the Garza Ranch. According to courtroom testimony given later by Zetas members themselves, including a man known by the nickname El Pájaro and another known as El Canelo, the victims were tied up, locked inside a large barn on the property, and killed there. After that, the cartel used barrels filled with diesel fuel and gasoline to dispose of the remains. The fires burned for hours. Local firefighters arrived at the property to put out a separate burning building and were chased off at gunpoint by Zetas members, who told them that if they came back or said anything about what they had seen, their own families would meet the same fate. The fire chief and his volunteers later testified to investigators that they had recognized the faces of both the cartel members and the police officers who were guarding the gates. The town's emergency line received roughly 1,450 calls during those 3 days. Almost none of them were answered. The mayor, a man named Sergio Lozano, was reportedly told days in advance that a wave of violence was coming. According to multiple statements from Allende police officers themselves, the police director called his officers into a meeting and told them that the mayor had agreed with the cartel that local authorities would stand down. Officers were told not to leave the station, not to respond to any calls, and to turn a blind eye, or they and their families would be killed. Nobody knows the exact number of people who died in those 3 days. Mexican state authorities at first estimated about 28 victims. Family groups and human rights investigators later estimated the real number was closer to 300 missing or dead. The bodies were destroyed so completely that all that remained at the ranch were ashes, tiny bone fragments, and bits of teeth. Most of the victims were not actually informants. Many of them had no connection to the cartel at all. They were simply ranch workers, friends, neighbors, and relatives who happened to share the wrong last names. To this day, only a handful of people, including a few corrupt police officers and a couple of Zetas members, have ever been convicted in the case. The mayor walked free. The police director has not faced trial. The Allende massacre showed the full scale of what a cartel could do when it suspected even a single informant in its ranks. But cartel revenge against snitches had not stopped in the era of paper files and tracked phones. By the early 2020s, in the very same Sinaloa cartel network that the Trevinos had once partnered with, a brand new generation of enforcers was using a different way to send the exact same message. Section 6. El Nini and the Sinaloa Cartel. Killing of a DEA confidential source. By the early 2020s, the Sinaloa Cartel was no longer being run by its old founder, Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera, the man known around the world as El Chapo. He had been arrested, extradited to the United States, and sentenced to life in a maximum security federal prison in 2019. After his removal, the cartel passed into the hands of his sons. The four brothers, Ivan Archibaldo Guzman Salazar, Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, Ovidio Guzman Lopez, and a fourth brother, became known as the Chapitos, which is a Spanish word that translates roughly to the Little Chapos. They took over the family business and pushed it deeper into one of the deadliest products in modern drug history: fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that is more than 50 times stronger than heroin, and it has become the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 and 49. The Chapitos became one of the largest suppliers of fentanyl to the United States. To protect their operations, the Chapitos created a special security unit to act as their personal protection, their muscle, and their executioners. This group became known as the Ninis. The man chosen to lead the Ninis was Nestor Isidro Perez Salas, who went by the nickname El Nini. According to the United States Department of Justice, El Nini received special training and ran a group of armed enforcers who were equipped with military-grade weapons, including machine guns and rocket launchers. They were not just bodyguards. They were the unit the Chapitos sent out whenever they needed someone hunted down, captured, questioned, or eliminated. According to U.S. court filings, El Nini's group was responsible for years of attacks against rival traffickers, against Mexican law enforcement officers, and against anyone the Chapitos viewed as a threat. Among the long list of alleged crimes laid out in 2 U.S. federal indictments against El Nini, 2 stand out for the focus of this list. The first one took place in 2017. According to the U.S. Justice Department, El Nini and a group of fellow enforcers conspired to kill a witness and an informant who was working with American law enforcement. That same year, El Nini and his Ninis also captured 3 members of the rival cartel known as Los Zetas, questioned them, and killed them. By that point, his reputation inside the cartel was that of a man who could be trusted to handle the cartel's most sensitive problems quietly and completely. The second incident, the one that finally brought the United States down on him with full force, took place in October of 2023. According to court documents filed in the Southern District of New York, the DEA had been working a major investigation into El Nini and his network. The investigation depended on a confidential source, a person who had agreed to share information with American agents about how the cartel operated. The DEA had built much of its case around that one person. Somebody on the cartel side discovered that the source was talking. According to U.S. prosecutors, El Nini sent his enforcers out to find that source. They did not just go after the informant. They went after anyone the cartel believed was tied to the informant in any way. In October of 2023, El Nini and his men kidnapped the confidential source, along with 10 other people in Mexico. One of those 10 was a United States citizen. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, the cartel believed each of these 11 people was either working for the source, related to the source, or somehow connected to the source's cooperation with the DEA. After they were taken, 8 of the 11, including the confidential source, were killed. Among the 8 killed was a 13-year-old boy. The Justice Department stated in writing that El Nini ordered these killings as direct revenge for the source's cooperation with American authorities. The international response was swift. Less than 2 months after the kidnappings, on November 22, 2023, Mexican authorities arrested El Nini in the city of Culiacan, in the heart of Sinaloa cartel territory. He had been hiding behind a wall of armed security. The DEA had been offering a $3 million reward for information leading to his capture. After his arrest in Mexico, the United States moved fast to bring him north. On May 25, 2024, El Nini was extradited from Mexico to the United States. He was 32 years old. He was presented in federal court in New York to face 2 separate indictments. The charges included leading a continuing criminal enterprise that resulted in deaths, kidnapping resulting in deaths, including the death of a child, importing and trafficking fentanyl, money laundering, and obstruction of justice by killing an informant. The combined charges carry mandatory minimums totaling decades behind bars, with the most serious counts carrying mandatory life sentences. Then U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland publicly tied his case directly to the killing of the DEA source, stating clearly that El Nini was responsible for the murder, torture, and kidnapping of rivals and witnesses, including a confidential source for the DEA, and others killed in retaliation for that source's cooperation. The case is still moving through the U.S. court system, but the indictments alone laid out in clear written terms what the cartel had done in the fall of 2023 and why. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The killing of the DEA source by El Nini was the most recent reminder of how dangerous it was to share information against a cartel, even with the protection of the United States government. But the price of being seen as an informant was not always paid by the informant alone. Sometimes the cartels were willing to take the lives of more than 100 completely innocent people, just to make sure they killed one suspected snitch. Section 7. Avianca Flight 203 and the Medellin cartel plan to eliminate informants. By the late 1980s, Colombia was at war with itself. On one side was the Colombian government. On the other side was a man named Pablo Escobar and the organization he led, known as the Medellin Cartel. Escobar was, at the height of his power, one of the richest men on earth. His cartel was bringing in close to $20 billion a year by selling cocaine into the United States. The fight between Escobar and the Colombian state had reached a level that no other country had ever experienced before. Judges, police officers, journalists, and politicians were being killed on the streets of Bogotá and Medellin almost every day. Escobar's main demand was simple. He wanted the Colombian government to ban a law that would allow him to be sent to the United States to stand trial. He had a famous saying that summed up his thinking. He would rather have a grave in Colombia than a prison cell in the United States. In the lead-up to the 1990 Colombian presidential election, the cartel had already shown how far it was willing to go. In August of 1989, Escobar's hitmen killed presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán in front of a public crowd at a campaign rally. Galán had been the strongest voice in favor of sending cartel leaders to the United States. After he was killed, his replacement on the ticket was a man named Cesar Gaviria, who took the same hardline stance. Escobar wanted Gaviria gone too. The cartel began planning an attack of a kind that had never been carried out in Colombia before. They would target Gaviria with a bomb on a passenger flight. The flight chosen was Avianca Flight 203. It was a domestic Colombian flight that was scheduled to fly from El Dorado International Airport in Bogotá to Alfonso Bonilla Aragon International Airport in Cali, on the morning of November 27, 1989. The aircraft was a Boeing 727 with the registration number HK1803. It had been built in 1966. It was operated by Avianca, the national airline of Colombia. The captain that morning was José Ignacio Osa Aristizabal, age 40. The first officer was Fernando Pizarro Esguerra, age 22. The flight engineer was Luis Jairo Castiblanco Vargas, age 34. There were 3 flight attendants on board with them, along with 101 passengers. In total, 107 people were going to fly that morning. According to detailed reporting in court records, in Mark Bowden's book Killing Pablo, and in the Colombian magazine Semana, the cartel's plan involved tricking a young Colombian man into carrying the bomb onto the plane. His name was Alberto Prieto. 2 of Escobar's men, both dressed in business suits, sat next to Prieto in seats 18A and 18K, on the road directly above the plane's main fuel tank. Prieto was told he was being given an electronic recording device that he simply needed to switch on once the plane was in the air. The recording, he was told, would capture a conversation involving a couple of nearby passengers. It was a lie. The device was a bomb made of plastic explosives. Just before takeoff, one of Escobar's men got off the plane. The other one stayed on board. Prieto, who had no idea what he was actually carrying, became known later by the nickname El Suizo, which is the Spanish word for the Swiss. He had been used as the trigger man, but he died never knowing what he was really doing. Flight 203 took off as scheduled at 7:13 in the morning. 5 minutes later, while flying at 4,000 meters above the ground at over 790 kilometers per hour, the explosive device detonated. The blast set off the fuel vapors inside the plane's central fuel tank. Witnesses on the ground saw fire shoot out of the right side of the aircraft. A second explosion broke the plane in half. The nose section split away from the tail section, and the wreckage came down in flames over the small town of Suacha, just outside Bogota. Pieces of the plane were spread out across a 5-kilometer radius. All 107 people on board were killed instantly. 3 more people on the ground were also killed by falling debris. The total death toll was 110. Cesar Gaviria, the man Escobar had wanted to kill, was not on the plane. He had been advised by his security team to change his travel plans. He went on to win the 1990 election and became the next president of Colombia. But there is another part of the story. According to courtroom testimony and reporting by the Denver Westward publication during the 1994 trial of Escobar's chief assassin, Dendini Muñoz Mosquera, also known as La Cuica, an alternate theory of the bombing was raised in U.S. federal court. That theory claimed the bomb was also intended to kill 2 known informants, a man named Carlos Andrés Escobi and a woman named Astrid del Pilar Gomez, both of whom were passengers on the flight. 2 American citizens were also among the dead, which was what allowed the United States Department of Justice to bring the prosecution. Muñoz Mosquera was eventually convicted in U.S. federal court and sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences in 1994. The Avianca bombing showed that Escobar was willing to take more than 100 completely innocent lives in order to silence his political enemies and any informants who might hurt his organization. But the price of being seen as a snitch was not always paid by the snitch themselves. Sometimes, in the world of the cartels, the punishment was placed on the people the snitch loved most. Section 8. Hector Luis Palma Salazar and the Sinaloa Cartel Family Killings. In the world of Mexican drug trafficking in the late 1980s, few stories have ever cut as deep or stayed as well documented as what happened to the family of a Sinaloa cartel co-leader named Hector Luis Palma Salazar. Palma, who is also widely known by his nickname El Güero Palma, which translates roughly to the light-skinned one, was born on April 29, 1960, in Mocorito, a small town in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. He came up in the criminal world the hard way. He started out as a car thief. From there, he worked his way into a job as a gunman for one of the most powerful drug bosses in Mexican history, a man named Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, who ran the original Guadalajara cartel. Palma rose quickly inside that organization. By the late 1980s, he had become a senior figure inside the cartel and a close associate of a younger trafficker who was just starting to make his name, a man called Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. Palma was married to a woman named Guadalupe Leja Serrano. The couple had 2 young children together, a son named Jesus, who was around 5 years old, and a daughter named Natalie, who was around 4 years old. By the time Palma was deep into his cartel career, his family life had already been shaken. In 1978, before the worst of his cartel years, Palma had been arrested in the U.S. state of Arizona on drug trafficking charges and sentenced to 8 years in an American prison. That prison stay would set off a chain of events that, years later, would cost his entire family their lives. In the late 1980s, after Palma was back in Mexico and working his way up the cartel, the relationship between him and his boss, Felix Gallardo, broke down. According to multiple verified accounts, including reporting in Mike Gray's book, Drug Crazy, the BBC, and Mexican publications such as Milenio and Excelsior, Palma was suspected of betraying the cartel by holding back the proceeds of a major cocaine shipment for himself. The mistrust between the boss and the soldier turned dangerous. Felix Gallardo decided that Palma needed to be punished in a way that would not just send a message to him personally, but to every other plaza boss in the cartel who might think about turning on the organization. He was not going to kill Palma directly. He was going to destroy what Palma loved. The man Felix Gallardo chose to handle the operation was a Venezuelan trafficker named Rafael Enrique Clavel. Clavel had a personal connection to the family already because he had previously been the boyfriend of Palma's own sister, Minerva Palma. That made him close enough to the household to be trusted. And that trust was exactly what made him dangerous. Clavel was sent to get close to Guadalupe Leja Serrano. He convinced her to leave Palma. He convinced her to withdraw $7 million from a bank account that was tied to her husband. And he convinced her to take her 2 young children with her and disappear from the family home. What Guadalupe did not know was that none of it was real. Clavel had no plan to start a new life with her. He had been sent to do exactly one job, and that job came directly from the cartel's top boss. Once he had separated her and the children from Palma, and once he had taken the cash, Clavel ended Guadalupe's life. He then sent her remains back to Palma. The 2 children, Jesus and Natalie, were taken across the border into Venezuela to a place called the Puente de la Concordia Bridge near the city of San Cristobal in the state of Táchira, only about 40 kilometers from the Colombian border. The children did not survive. Both of them, a 5-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl, were killed at the bridge. The cartel reportedly recorded what happened. The recording, along with everything else, was sent to Palma as a message. For Palma, what followed was a years-long path of revenge that became part of cartel history in Mexico. According to verified accounts in Mike Gray's reporting, Palma personally tracked down and ordered the deaths of multiple people he held responsible. He had Felix Gallardo's personal lawyer killed. He had members of Clavel's own family targeted in return. Clavel himself was eventually arrested by authorities and placed in prison, but he never stood trial. He was killed by another inmate, on what Mexican investigative reports later said were direct orders that originated from Palma. The cycle of payback reached every person Palma believed had played a role in what happened to his wife and his children. Palma went on to become one of the founding co-leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, working alongside El Chapo Guzmán. He ran the cartel at the highest level until June 23, 1995, when he was arrested by the Mexican military after his small private jet crashed near Tepic, Nayarit. He served 19 years inside a maximum security prison in the United States. He was deported back to Mexico in 2016, where he was charged with the killing of 2 Mexican police officers. As of today, he is still being held inside the Altiplano Federal Maximum Security Prison near Mexico City. He built a special memorial in a Culiacan cemetery for his wife and his 2 children, and that memorial still stands. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Palma's case showed how cartels punished people they viewed as snitches and traitors by going after the people they loved. But cartel revenge was not always carried out in private. Sometimes, the boss himself wanted to be there in person, with a camera rolling, to make sure the world saw the message. Section 9. Edgar Valdez Villarreal. La Barbie in the Beltran Leva recordings of suspected snitches. Edgar Valdez Villarreal does not look on paper like a typical Mexican cartel boss. He was not born in Mexico. He grew up in Texas. He played football at United High School in Laredo, Texas, where his coach gave him his lifelong nickname, La Barbie, because of his blonde hair, blue eyes, and light skin, which the coach said reminded him of a Ken doll. La Barbie was born on August 11, 1973. He was a popular high school athlete. His own father offered to pay for him to go to college. He turned the offer down. By his late teens, he was already selling marijuana on the streets of Laredo. By his early 20s, he was facing trafficking charges in U.S. court. To stay out of an American prison, he crossed the border into Mexico, where he linked up with one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the country, the Beltran Leva cartel. Within a few years, he had become one of the most feared enforcers in all of Mexico. The Beltran Leva cartel had originally been a part of the Sinaloa cartel, but by the mid-2000s, it had broken away and become its own organization. The cartel's main rival, especially in the border region around Nuevo Laredo, was a group called Los Zetas, which at the time was the enforcement wing of the Gulf Cartel. The fight between the two sides was one of the bloodiest in Mexican history. La Barbie was placed in charge of an enforcement squad of his own called Los Negros. Los Negros worked directly for the Beltran Leva organization, but they answered first to La Barbie. They recruited corrupt police officers, military deserters, federal agents, and street-level gang members from the United States. According to the U.S. House Committee on Homeland Security, La Barbie's group was even known to bring in members of street gangs like MS-13 and the Mexican Mafia to do certain jobs. What set La Barbie apart from other cartel enforcers was a habit that at the time was new in the Mexican drug world. He filmed it. According to Wikipedia, the New York Times, the BBC, the Christian Science Monitor, the Dallas Morning News, and Mexican news outlets, La Barbie used video cameras to record the questioning and the deaths of people his cartel believed were enemies, snitches, or rivals. The most famous of these recordings surfaced publicly in late 2005. It was obtained by the Dallas Morning News and reported on widely. The video showed 4 men who had been captured by Los Negros. The men were Zetas. They had been sent into Beltran Leva territory on what the cartel believed was a mission to kill La Barbie himself. Instead, La Barbie's men had captured them first. In the video, the 4 captured Zetas were shown sitting on the ground, beaten and bloodied. They were forced to identify themselves on camera. They were asked who they worked for. They were asked who had sent them. They were asked what their orders had been. According to the Texas Monthly's reporting and Rolling Stone magazine's profile of La Barbie, the men admitted on camera that they were Zetas and that they were working under orders from one of their commanders. One of them described being a hawk, which is a low-level cartel job watching the streets and reporting back to bosses. Another described his role as a recruiter. Another talked about a method of cartel killing in which the victim is questioned and then quietly disposed of. a method known in cartel slang as el guiso. By the end of the video, at least one of the 4 men was killed on camera. The cartel did not just keep the recording for themselves. They released it. They wanted it to be seen. Authorities later said that Barbie may have ordered the recording, in part, as personal revenge for the killing of his own brother, Armando Valdez Villarreal, who had been killed by the Zetas in Nuevo Laredo. The point of putting the video out into the world was to send a clear message to anyone who was thinking of working with Los Zetas, anyone who was thinking of giving information to them, and anyone inside the Beltran Leva organization who was thinking of betraying it. In the years that followed, more recordings appeared online, all of them following a similar format. Captives identified themselves. Questions were asked. Answers were given. The recording made the rounds. In total, the gang war that Barbie was tied to is believed to have caused more than 150 deaths. According to court records and journalistic investigations, including the Anabel Hernandez investigation, later published in Aristegui Noticias, Barbie himself also passed information to the US DEA and FBI between 2008 and 2010. While at the same time running his own enforcement squad in Mexico. He was arrested by Mexican federal police on August 30th, 2010, at a rural house near Mexico City. After his capture, he was paraded in front of cameras for a video of his own, this one filmed by the Mexican government, in which he calmly described how his cartel moved cocaine from Panama into the United States. He was extradited to the United States on September 30th, 2015. He pleaded guilty in 2016 to drug trafficking and money laundering charges. And on June 11th, 2018, a U.S. federal court sentenced him to 49 years in prison. He was sent to USP Coleman II, a high-security federal prison in Florida. Barbie's videos showed how cartels used the deaths of suspected snitches as a public message. But not every informant in this story was a public face. Some were silent partners working with U.S. agents from inside the cartel itself. And the price one such man paid alongside Camarena has, until now, often been left out of the story. Section 10. Alfredo Zavala Avelar and the Forgotten DEA. Asset of the Camarena case. The story of the Mexican pilot named Alfredo Zavala Avelar is one of the most overlooked stories in the entire history of the war between U.S. law enforcement and the Mexican cartels. He is almost always mentioned in passing, as a footnote, as the man who was kidnapped on the same day as DEA agent Kiki Camarena. But Alfredo Zavala Avelar was a real human being with his own life, his own job, his own family, and his own decision to help the United States government against one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations on Earth. For that decision, he paid the same price that Kiki Camarena paid. The world remembers Kiki by name. For a long time, almost nobody outside law enforcement remembered Alfredo. Alfredo Zavala Avelar was a Mexican civilian pilot. According to verified accounts in major U.S. news outlets, including the Washington Times, NBC News, and the federal civil lawsuit filed by the Camarena family in March of 2025, Zavala worked closely with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration as an aerial surveillance asset. He was, in plain terms, an informant for the Americans. His role was to fly small planes over remote parts of Mexico and take photographs of suspected drug trafficking activity. For about 4 years before the events of February 1985, he had flown surveillance missions tied to a U.S. and Mexican joint anti-drug program known as Operation Condor. He was good at his job. He knew the country from the air. He could spot things that ground-based investigators could not. In the early 1980s, Alfredo became one of Kiki Camarena's most important assets. The two of them flew together. According to the Britannica entry on the Guadalajara cartel, the federal civil lawsuit, and reporting at the time, Alfredo's flight work helped pinpoint the location of one of the largest marijuana plantations ever discovered in Mexico, Rancho Búfalo, in the state of Chihuahua. The DEA used the photos and the flight data Alfredo provided to confirm that the plantation existed, that it was massive, and that it was almost certainly tied to top members of the Guadalajara cartel. In 1984, 450 Mexican soldiers, backed by helicopters, raided the ranch. They destroyed roughly 2,500 acres of crop. By some estimates, the loss to the cartel was worth around $8 billion in annual production. Cartel boss Rafael Caro Quintero alone, according to court findings, lost roughly $50 million in destroyed product. The cartel wanted to know exactly who had given the Americans the information that brought it down. They suspected Kiki Camarena. They also suspected the man who had been flying the planes. On February 7, 1985, the same day Kiki Camarena was grabbed off the streets of Guadalajara in broad daylight, a separate group of corrupt officers grabbed Alfredo Zavala Avelar near the Guadalajara airport. According to the federal civil lawsuit filed in March of 2025, both men were taken to a private property linked to Rafael Caro Quintero. Both men were questioned. The cartel wanted to know how much the DEA knew, who their informants were, and whether the Americans had names of Mexican government officials who were tied to the cartel. The questioning of both men was done over a period of about 30 hours. Alfredo did not survive. According to autopsy findings reported in the Washington Times and confirmed in court filings, he had been buried alive at one point during his ordeal. Both men were killed on or around February 9, 1985, 2 days after they were taken. Their bodies were wrapped in plastic and buried on a rural farm. About 3 weeks later, the cartel had the bodies dug up and moved to a different location, on a property near the small town of La Angostura in the Mexican state of Michoacán, in an apparent attempt to throw off investigators. On March 5, 1985, federal police, acting on an anonymous tip, found the two bodies. Alfredo was identified along with Kiki at the scene. A forensic exam later showed that both men had suffered extensive injuries and that both men had died from blows to the head and neck. When the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration launched Operation Allende, the largest homicide investigation in the agency's history, the focus quickly fell on the loss of one of their own, Kiki Camarena. Alfredo's story was always there, but it was always second. He was a Mexican civilian, not an American agent. The Mexican government did not push to make his case a national symbol the way the United States pushed for Kiki. For decades, his role in the case was reduced to a single sentence in articles about Kiki, usually identifying him only as the DEA's pilot. That has slowly started to change. In March of 2025, when the Camarena family filed a federal civil lawsuit in California against the Sinaloa cartel, Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the lawsuit named Alfredo Zavala Avelar by name. It described his role as a DEA asset in plain terms. It detailed his kidnapping, his torture, and his death alongside Kiki. The same year, after Caro Quintero was extradited from Mexico to face U.S. federal charges, the indictments tied to the case once again named Alfredo as one of the two victims. 40 years after he was killed, his name is finally being said again in U.S. federal court in the same sentence as Kiki Camarena. Both men were killed for the same reason. Both men paid the same price for the same decision. They tried to help. That ends our list of 10. 10 different people in 10 different cases across 4 decades and across multiple countries. Each one of them is a reminder of the same hard truth about the world the cartels built and the rules they enforced. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.